as we leave behind this establishment of a daily food supply for the Israelites, something called manhu, manna. Manhu means, what is it? What is it? I don't know, but eat it. We're going to move on into Exodus now, chapter 17. So open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 17. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 79. Exodus chapter 17. Follow along with me. The whole community of the people of Israel left the Sin desert, traveling in stages as Adonai had ordered, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moshe, demanding, "Give us water to drink." But Moshe replied, "Why pick a fight with me? Why are you testing Adonai?" However, the people were thirsty for water there and grumbled against Moses. "For what did you bring us up from Egypt? To kill us, our children, our livestock with thirst?" And Moses cried out to Adonai, "What am I to do with these people? They're ready to stone me." And Adonai answered Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and bring with you the leaders of Israel. Take your staff in your hand, the one you used to strike the river, and go. I will stand in front of you there on the rock in Horeb. You are to strike the rock, and water will come out of it so the people can drink." And Moses did this in the sight of the leaders of Israel. The place was named Massah and Merivah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested Adonai by asking, "Is Adonai with us or not?" Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And Moshe said to Joshua, "Choose men for us, go out and fight with Amalek, and tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with God's staff in my hand." Joshua did as Moshe had told him and fought with Amalek. Then Moshe, Aharon, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And when Moshe raised his hand, Israel prevailed, but when he let it down, Amalek prevailed. However, Moshe's hands grew heavy. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aharon and Hur held up his hands, the one on the one side, the other on the other, so that his hands stayed steady until sunset. Then Joshua defeated Amalek, putting their people to the sword. Adonai said to Moses, "Write this in a book to be remembered, and tell it to Joshua. I will completely blot out any memory of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar, called it Adonai Nisi, and said, "Because their hand was against the throne of Yah, Adonai will fight Amalek generation after generation." As the 17th chapter of Exodus opens, we have the Israelites leaving the Sin desert and moving on towards Mount Sinai, also known as Mount Horeb, also known as the mountain of God. Now, one wonders if they had understood the significance of the occurrences and of the last several weeks, or had any inkling that God was in the process of molding and shaping them. Is it possible that the miracles of the plagues against Egypt, the Hebrews' release from bondage, the parting of the Red Sea, and the turning of the bitter waters of Marah into sweet, drinkable water could be so easily dismissed and forgotten in just a few days? Their faith going up and down like an elevator? I mean, how could it be that the visible cloud that led the way both day and night, God's actual and real presence with them, wasn't enough to assure them at all times that God was in control? But such was the case with this weak, quarrelsome, insecure people. Let's hope it's not the case with us as well. Once again, they need water. They're human. They were in a barren desert. Needing water is a necessity of life, and it's a pretty reasonable concern. Their journey necessarily was one of moving from oasis to oasis. Now, food was no longer an issue, but water was always an issue to nomadic tent dwellers. There is no indication that the Israelites even thought to approach God about their need for water. Rather, their first thought was to gripe. They worried, they doubted, they feared, and they blamed. They blamed Moses and they blamed Jehovah God. This situation was a little different than before when they needed water, because where Moses led them this time, there was not even a hint of water, which in itself is pretty strange. Moses was an experienced desert dweller, having lived in Midian. And I suggest he had lived only a few miles away from where the people of Israel stood thirsty at this very moment. He would only have taken them to a place where normally there would have been water. So probably we're dealing with some kind of an unusual drought condition on the Arabian Peninsula, and the water source that Moses expected to be present near a place called Rephidim was dried up. Now, naturally, this was indeed a potential disaster. Yet one would reasonably assume that Israel would have remembered back to only a couple of weeks earlier at the bitter springs of Marah that God had miraculously made this undrinkable water drinkable for them. Apparently, they not only forgot about God's interest in sustaining their physical lives and their need for water, but they never grasped the significance and lesson contained within his solution. Let's revisit that Marah incident for just a moment. Back in chapter 15 of Exodus, we saw that Israel was grumbling and in need of water. And Moses brings them to a spring, to an oasis, that in its natural state had water, but it had a very bitter taste to it. But when some special unnamed wood, obviously something that was available locally, is immersed into that bitter water, at God's command, the water is cleaned of its bad taste, and it becomes useful to save their lives. I mean, this is such a beautiful picture of what Messiah was going to do for us 1,400 years into the future. Here we are, mankind, our corrupt natural state being full of bitterness. Bitterness in our Western way of thinking generally is an emotion, or it's an attitude, it's a mental state. It means that we're hanging on to our hurts and to our offenses. We've developed a sense that life is unfair to us. And as a result, we view the world around us cynically. I mean, we reject joy. But that typically is not what the Bible means by bitterness. Rather, scripturally, bitterness is the opposite of sweet, both in a real and in a poetic sense. Bitter means some unbearable pain, usually at the hands of another, suffered with no hope of escape. It's oppression. The root word for bitter, marah, is even associated with poison. The Jews of Nazi Germany were bitter, meaning they were in a hopeless state of oppression beyond their own control. That's what the Bible means by bitterness. Now, bitter as a negative state of existence is often used to describe the Israelite condition in Egypt. And bitter is also the usual condition of all mankind. We're unable to save ourselves. We're unable to change ourselves. We're unable to shuck off our bitter existence, even if we don't recognize it as bitterness. But now comes Christ, who is hung onto a piece of wood. His precious blood spilled all over it. And what miraculous qualities that wood, that cross, has. For when that divine wood, the cross, is immersed into our lives and our bitterness, our oppression, and all of that is taken away from us. Often when something is immersed into a liquid, the object takes on a different character. In point of fact, the Greek word baptismo, from which we get our English word baptize, means to immerse. And the word baptismo is a word that was borrowed from the cloth dyeing trade of the biblical era. That is, a natural cloth was baptismo into a vat of dye. And then the cloth would take on the characteristics of that which it was immersed into. And so it is with us, with those who are crucified with Yeshua. His wooden cross, immersed into our bitter lives, transforms our lives and makes them sweet and free from the oppression of the power of sin. This is the picture that is intended for us at the spring of Marah, out in the wilderness. Well, returning to chapter 17, and Israel's newest need for water, Moses reminded them that while they might think their grumbling is against him, it's really against God. And Moses wants to know, why would you test God? What's wrong with you people? Now remember our Hebrew lesson about this word test or prove or tempt we see in some versions. And the Hebrew word used here is the same as we saw earlier, nacha. And it carries with it the sense of being hauled into a courtroom and being put before a judge. It brings to mind a trial proceeding. So what Moses accuses the people of doing is literally putting God on trial. They were putting themselves in the position of judging God. Yet once again, God's merciful. Rather than rebuking Moses or the people for their lack of faith, he simply provides for them. God tells Moses to take the people's representatives, called the elders, and go to the rock, or Mount Horeb. There, using the same staff that Moses used to part the Red Sea, to smite the water in Egypt, to turn it to blood, Moses was to strike that rock and water would just pour from it, enough for everybody. It's interesting that this is the second time that we have found found Moses being ordered to strike something with his staff, and it has to do with water. Always has to do with water. The first time was when he struck the Nile River. Remember, turning it to bloody red, making it undrinkable. Now he's going to strike a rock. The rock will produce drinkable water. Notice how the staff of Moses, which is really but God's staff of authority, placed into Moses' hands, was used in one case at the Nile for wrath upon people who were not his people, the Egyptians. But in our current case, that same staff would be used to provide mercy, protection for his own people. It's important that we see this difficult attribute of God. It is that from the same source, the Lord, comes blindness and revelation, comes destruction and salvation, comes darkness and light, comes shalom and comes despair. Same source. Goodness to those who submit to his lordship, but calamity to those who refuse his lordship. See, we commit a terrible idolatry. Although I know we don't never think of it that way. We are actually committing idolatry when we discard those characteristics of God that bother us. And we hang on only to the ones that please us. Because indeed, to do so makes us guilty of forming our own God image from our own minds. That is the definition of idolatry. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out what could not possibly have been understood by Moses and the elders. That this event of striking the rock is yet another shadow of a future event, Christ is often called the rock. And he was smitten, struck, that living water would pour forth from him for all of God's people. And let's also remember that when Yeshua, who was himself living water, was stabbed with that Roman spear, all who were watching saw real physical water pour from that wound. This event at Horeb and the crucifixion at Calvary were completely connected on both a physical and spiritual level. Now, I want to point out one other interesting connection that's not readily seen in English, but it is in the original Hebrew. Moses was to use his staff, his rod, in God's name to strike that rock at Horeb just like he struck the Nile a year earlier. Remember back in earlier chapters of Exodus when we discovered that the word used to describe the 9 blows that God visited upon Egypt that we usually call plagues was in Hebrew negah. Don't mix up a couple of similar sounding Hebrew words like negah, nacha. Nacha means to go to a trial. Negah means to strike, to hit, to deliver a blow. This word negah, meaning to hit, would not be used to describe something benign like striking a nail with a hammer. It carries with it the sense of attacking with a purpose, to harm, even to kill. Looking back, we can understand why negah would have been used to appropriately describe these harmful and eventually deadly strokes upon Egypt that began with Moses striking the Nile River. So the use of the word negah when describing hitting the rock so that water would come forth from it seems out of place. I mean, what would be the point of using a word like negah that has with it an aura of malice and violence in this setting where a rock is being struck so water will pour forth? Rabbis have mused for centuries on just why that word, negah, which portrays striking with a sense of harm, why would that be used with Moses bringing forth water for his people to drink? If it weren't for the connection with what would eventually happen to the true rock, our rock, Yeshua, when he was struck with malice and with violence, the use of that Hebrew word here at Mount Horeb would then be out of place. But now we see the connection. We're told in verse 7 that the place where the Israelites grumbled about needing water was named Massah and Merivah, usually translated as testing and quarreling. I think a better translation of Massah than testing would be tempting. And by the way, notice that this is not the same word as used earlier when Moses accused the people of putting God on trial. That word was nacha, while the name of the place is Massah, an M. Why is the word tempting, then, so appropriate here? Because these people who have followed this cloud of glory for 2 months, they now slap God in the face by asking at the end of verse 7, well, is God with us or not? Suddenly in verse 8, scene changes. And the people become engaged in their first battle with a hostile neighbor. Now this, of course, was the very thing that God had arranged for Israel to avoid in their first days of their exodus by insisting that they take the desert wilderness route rather than taking the direct route to Canaan that uses a major highway between Egypt and Canaan called the way of the Philistines. For whatever reason, this battle with Amalek was a battle God wanted Israel to fight. It is a group of people called Amalek. that attacked Israel. And we're going to find out later in Deuteronomy 25 that Amalek actually attacked the rear of this long column of Israel, which consisted primarily of the stragglers, the feeble, the weak, the sickly. And this is what made Amalek all the more horrendous. Because Amalek in no way threatened, Israel in no way threatened Amalek. But it is not surprising at all that it would be Amalek as the first to make an attack upon Israel. Because the Amalekites were the descendants of Esau. So while Amalek was related to Israel because of the split between the twin brothers, Jacob and Esau, they were also enemies. Remember how Jacob connived to get that firstborn blessing and all the wealth and power that went with it away from his twin brother, Esau. And then later, Jacob became called Israel, and he produced the 12 tribes of Israel. In verse 9, Moses instructs Joshua, who would eventually become the leader of Israel after Moses' death, to select some men who would go fight Amalek and then lead them in battle. As for Moses, he would stand on a hill above the battlefield, probably with his staff in hand. And along with him up on the hill would go his brother Aaron and a man named Hur. Now we can understand why Aaron, Moses' prophet, would accompany him. But who is this Hur fellow? Well, we find him mentioned again in Exodus 24:14. He seems to be Aaron's assistant, although in the genealogies he does not appear to be a blood relative of Aaron's. Talmudic tradition is that Hur was Miriam's husband. Of course, Miriam was Moses and Aaron's sister. Well, the battle begins. Joshua's down in the valley leading his men, Moses, Aaron, and Hur up on the hilltop observing Moses raising up his hands. And it's usually presumed that he was holding a staff in his hand. That's not what the scriptures say. The presumption that he held his staff in his hand comes from the name of the victory altar that was built to commemorate this battle, because the altar's name, Yehovah Nisi, implies that a banner or an insignia of some other kind of device that symbolized Israel was used by Moses. And verse 11 says that a very strange thing occurred. As long as Moses held his staff in the air towards the heavens, the battle tilted in Israel's favor. But as soon as he put his arm holding the staff down for a rest, the battle swung towards Amalek. So Aaron and Hur had Moses sit on a stone, then one man on each side. They would prop up Moses' arms so that the staff would not have to be lowered as Moses' arms grew tired, not even for a momentary rest. Well, this battle went on and on. Battles in that day did, until sunset. So Joshua's men defeated Amalek. Now here's a couple of items of interest. First of all, let's talk a little about Joshua. Joshua was of the tribe of EPHRAIM. Hopefully you will recall the last 3 chapters of Genesis, where the importance of the tribe of EPHRAIM was discussed. In fact, to understand, hear me on this, because I know we have plenty of people here that like prophecy in the end times information. For you to understand the end times, and even the book of Revelation, you really need to study Ephraim, about Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim. This is a key that unlocks the door to many biblical mysteries. Now, technically, at the time of this battle with Amalek, Joshua wasn't yet called Joshua. His name was Hoshea, or in English, Hosea. This is not the same Hosea, by the way, as the prophet Hosea that has his own Bible book named after him. Hoshea means help or salvation. Now, sometime following this battle, Hoshea's name was changed. And we've seen this name changing happen before, haven't we? Abraham started out as just Abram, Avram, meaning father of many. Later, God said, you will now be Avraham, meaning exalted father. Later on yet, we saw Jacob, Yaakov's name changed to Israel. Now Hoshea is going to have his name changed to Joshua. Now these two names, Joshua and Hoshea, are related, but we really can't see it until they're presented in their original Hebrew. Joshua is in Hebrew Yehoshua, Yehoshua, which means Yah saves, or better, God saves, or better yet, and most accurately, Yehovah saves. And most accurately in Hebrew, Hoshea is really pronounced Hoshua or Oshea. So after the battle with Amalek, Hoshua, Hosea, has the word Yah added as a prefix to his name, so now it becomes Yah-Hashua. Yah-Hashua. So it's easy to see after this strange battle where Moses has to hold his staff up high in order to God in order for Israel to beat Amalek, that the leader and victor of this momentous battle would have his name changed to a name that reflected what happened that day when God saved Israel from Amalek. Now, one more thing and we'll move on. Yehoshua in Hebrew is simply longhand for a name we've already all become familiar with. Yeshua. Jesus Christ. Yep. In our modern vocabulary, Joshua is the name Christ was born with. And in Hebrew, Joshua is Yeshua. Our Lord had the same name that this man did who won the battle against Amalek. Here again, we have an Old Testament connection to the New. Joshua, friend of Moses, physically saves Israel through God's power. Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus Christ, spiritually saves Israel and all who would be joined to Israel through God's power. In both cases, this was an act of God doing the saving. And I want to assure you these connections are real, they're not contrived, and they're there for us to see these connections. Unfortunately, oftentimes the connection is invisible until it's presented in its original Hebrew. Now, at the end of chapter 17, we get this bone-chilling instruction from God. He's going to completely blot out the memory of the people of Amalek, we're told, from under heaven. He's going to fight Amalek generation after generation. Why? Why is this ultimate condemnation from God upon the people of Amalek? Well, Amalek was not only real and tangible, being exactly as they're reported, doing as exactly as reported as well, but they're also a type. Amalek was Gentiles. And so they represent those Gentiles who come against Israel, who hate Israel. Amalek were the first people to attack Israel after their redemption from Egypt. Israel's redeemed, and now Amalek's the first people to attack them as a redeemed people. Amalek represents that force which opposes God's people and God's plan that is to be worked out through his people. This is not the last time we're going to hear about Amalek in the Bible. Saul, first king of Israel, will be commanded by God to do what? Destroy Amalek as a punishment for their attempt to stop the advance of Israel during Moses' days as the leader of Israel. And by the way, Saul never accomplished that. Several centuries later, the evil Haman, thank you very much, the evil Haman of Esther fame, all right. Of Esther fame, is said to have been a descendant of Amalek. Many Arabs today, many, are from the tribe of Amalek, which is the tribe of Esau. The Jordanians, for instance, are a people whose ancestors are a mix of Ishmael and Esau. Moses, we're told, then built an altar. Now, this was a typical action of people in that day in reaction to a very important event. This altar was a monument, it was a marker to commemorate the battle of Israel and God against Amalek. The altar was named Yehovah Nisi. Yehovah, God's name, is my banner. Now, as we end this chapter, I'm going to mention something briefly about Moses' staff and it being referred to as a banner. There is a critical God principle being set up here, and it's this. This is not at all allegory. When we turn over our staff, and we all have one, when we loosen our grip for our own authority and we turn it over to God, it becomes God's staff in his hands. Understand that in ancient times, a staff, sometimes referred to as a rod, other times as a scepter, particularly if it involves a king, is a symbol, it's a representation of authority. Moses' staff, in human terms, was a symbol of Moses' authority. When he raised his staff to heaven, the Bible calls that raising a banner. It is symbolic of Moses turning his authority over to God, whereby God does something miraculous. The staff of Moses becomes the staff of God. This is the secret to the believer's life. This is the secret to it. And as long as we cling to our own personal authority and own lordship over our lives, then we're simply not usable by God. We're just not. And there is no power in our own authority. The strongest, most powerful, most brilliant, most wealthy of us ultimately have only our own personal natural human abilities to count on. And they can be considerable. But turn that authority over to God, and he will fit it with his power. Moses' staff under Moses' authority was just a piece of dead wood, even though it seemed to him like an indispensable tool of his trade as a shepherd. It was a necessary symbol of his authority over Israel. But at that same staff, placed under God's authority, it could turn the Nile River to blood. It could part the Red Sea. It could defeat an enemy in battle. This principle is often expressed in the modern evangelical Christian community as yielding or surrendering to God. We see that principle being developed right here in Exodus, in the Torah, with Moses. Let's move on to Exodus chapter 18. Exodus chapter 18. Turn your Bibles to Exodus 18. You have a complete Jewish Bible, turn the page. Page 80. Now, YITRO, Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moshe's father-in-law, heard about all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how Adonai had brought Israel out of Egypt. And after Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah and her two sons, YITRO, Moshe's father-in-law, had taken them back. The name of the one son was Gershom, for Moses had said, I have been a foreigner in the foreign land. The name of the other was Eleazar, because the God of my father helped me by rescuing me from Pharaoh's sword. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' son and his wife to him in the desert, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. And he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, YITRO, I'm coming to you with your wife and her two sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he prostrated himself, and he kissed him. And then after inquiring of each other's welfare, they entered the tent. Moshe told his father-in-law all that Adonai had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships they had suffered while traveling, and how Adonai had rescued them. Jethro rejoiced over all the good that Adonai had done for Israel by rescuing them from the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be Adonai, who has rescued you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, who has rescued the people from the harsh hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Adonai is greater than all other gods, because he rescued those who were treated so arrogantly. YITRO, Moshe's father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the leaders of Israel to share the meal before God with Moshe's father-in-law. Now the following day Moshe sat to settle disputes for the people, while the people stood around Moshe from morning till evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing to the people, he said, What is this that you are doing to the people? Why do you sit there alone, with all the people standing around you from morning until evening? Moses answered his father-in-law, It's because the people come to me seeking God's guidance. And whenever they have a dispute, it comes to me. I judge between one person and another. I explain to them God's laws and his teachings. And Moses' father-in-law said to him, But what you're doing isn't good. You will certainly wear yourself out, and not only yourself, but these people here with you as well. It's too much for you. You can't do it alone by yourself. So listen now to what I have to say. I'll give you some advice, and God will be with you. You should represent the people before God, and you should bring their cases to God. You should also teach them the laws and the teachings and show them how to live their lives and what work they should do. But you should choose from among all the people competent men who are God-fearing, honest, incorruptible, to be their leaders in charge of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Now, normally, they will settle the people's disputes. They should bring you the difficult cases, but ordinary matters, they should decide themselves. In this way, they will make it easier for you and share the load with you. And if you do this, and God is directing you to do it, you will be able to endure. And all these people, too, will arrive at their destination peacefully. Moshe paid attention to his father-in-law's counsel, and he did everything he said. And Moshe chose competent men from all Israel. He made them heads over the people in charge of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And as a general rule, they settled the people's disputes. The difficult cases they brought to Moshe, but every simple matter they decided themselves. Then Moshe let his father-in-law leave, and he went off to his own country. It was long ago recognized by ancient Hebrew sages that this chapter is out of its chronological sequence. The mention of God's laws, of an altar, of Moses teaching God's rules to the people, then judging them according to those rules, could only have occurred after the law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. So as chapter 18 opens, Moses' father-in-law makes a reappearance. YITRO, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He's heard about all that has happened concerning Israel, and he comes to greet Moses. And as we've discussed, news travels fast in those days. People in many nations knew what was going on in other regions. And you can bet that there were many regions and nations that were holding their collective breath, wondering just where this 3 million strong horde was going to land. Now, this is another of the many chapters of Exodus that, for reasons unknown to me, but I have my suspicions, the Bible translators consistently choose to use the word God or Lord whenever the Hebrew word Yehovah appeared. So when we look at the original language texts, we see that YITRO, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, knew the God of the Hebrews' name. And we can safely assume that the same people and nations who knew of the happenings in Egypt concerning Israel also in time knew the name of Israel's God. Yud-He-Vav-He, the Hebrew characters, Yehovah. In that era, knowing a God's name was considered vitally important because the superstition was that if you knew the name of the God who lorded over some area of responsibility like the weather or fertility or prosperity or battle, then by invoking that particular God's name, that God had to do what you requested. One of YITRO's purposes for coming to meet Moses was to bring Moses' wife, Zipporah, this was his daughter, this was YITRO's daughter, plus her 2 sons, to Moses. It says in verse 2 that she'd been sent home. That pretty well fits with the tradition concerning Zipporah that she was a real firebrand. She created such a problem for Moses that when Moses was on his way from Midian to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, he sent her home. Anyone remember what the name Zipporah means? It's a Bedouin name. It means bird, of which he was anything but. And by the way, that name's still in use today. It is generally thought that the rather interesting episode where Zipporah publicly confronts Moses about his not having yet circumcised his sons and God being angry with Moses to the point of threatening his life is what led to this incident of Moses sending his wife Zipporah and her sons home to Jethro, her father. Well, verse 5 says that Moses was at the mountain of God when YITRO showed up. Now, this is kind of interesting because it is another proof that this story is a little bit out of order in Exodus, because we don't even hear of the Exodus refugees moving and encamping at the foot of Mount Sinai until the next chapter. Now, I warned you last week that the Torah is not always in perfect chronological order. This is one of those instances. But this is also well in line with the God-instructed incident of the striking of the rock in order that water might be obtained, because it is said that this rock was in the mountain range of Horeb, which is the mountain range where Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, is located. And I think it also reveals that Jethro knew exactly where this mountain of God was. He knew this place. Why would he know it? Because A, it was very near to his own homeland of Midian, and because there apparently had been some sort of correspondence between Moses and YITRO, as it says in verse 6, and because very likely Moses had taken him there. Some years earlier, at the least, he made it very clear to Jethro where this place was. I don't want to run it into the ground, but it is very likely that the mountain of God was no more than a very few days' journey from YITRO's home. So it places Mount Sinai right where the Apostle Paul says it is, in Arabia, or better, on the Arabian Peninsula. Let's remember that the mountain of God where Moses was leading the Israelite people is the same place where Moses had encountered God in the burning bush. At the time of the burning bush, Moses was living with his father-in-law where? The land of Midian. And that's where the bush was in Midian. We read that Moses ran out to meet his father-in-law and fell prostrate before him. This is just a traditional sign of respect. Now, it would sure be fun to have been able, I think, to overhear their conversation. Perhaps to hear Moses talking to his young boys and listening to their stories about what had been happening in their lives during his absence. I'd sure like to know which Zipporah showed up too. The one that mellowed out a little bit, remorseful maybe, kind of missing her husband, or the one that gave him heck for going in the first place and then for being gone too long. And of course, to hear Moses recounting these miracles, miracle after breathtaking miracle that Yehovah had performed to save Israel, but to reduce Egypt to devastation. Then undoubtedly relating to Jethro the unending problems of dealing with this enormous population of never satisfied, ungrateful people who never missed an opportunity to tell Moses just what he was doing wrong. In verses 9 through 12, many scholars think we have a recounting of a Gentile conversion to the religion of the Hebrews. Yes, YITRO was a Gentile. He was not an Israelite. And although he is called a priest, he was not a priest of Jehovah, but of some other religion, some other system of gods. We just don't have to assume that because the only priestly tribe of Israel was the Levites, with the Levite Aaron as the high priest. See, there's no indication anywhere that YITRO could have possibly been a member of Israel, let alone a Levite. So in order to offer a sacrifice on Israel's altar, he would have had to have confessed loyalty to Israel and to the God of Israel. We get a very important glimpse into the minds of the people of that era because Jethro, speaks of the stories he's heard concerning the power of this Hebrew God. And it got confirmed. All these stories got confirmed by Moses. And in verse 11, YITRO makes the confession that this Jehovah must be greater than all other gods. He follows that up with making a sacrifice to Jehovah in the presence of Moses and Aaron and all the elders of Israel, and then it's all finished up with a meal. This was the standard way of making a covenant, a berit in Hebrew. Back in Genesis, we discussed at length how covenants were made. And we see here that what YITRO did was to make a covenant before God, probably declaring his allegiance to Jehovah, therefore to Israel. So did he, therefore, this is our question, renounce his other gods that he'd been worshiping, gods that he was a priest for? Did he now adhere to a monotheistic ideal, there only being one God? Probably not. He simply acknowledged that Jehovah was the God of the Hebrews and that he was the El, the chief God, which would have set just fine with Israel. Because in general, that's how they viewed Jehovah as well. Just the greatest God among all the many gods. Now I want to point out something else for you that's going to become more apparent after we finish Exodus, and you'll find it in the book of Leviticus. Verse 12, almost universally in English translation, says that Jethro brought a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. What it says in the original language is that YITRO brought an olah and a zeva for Jehovah. The olah is a very specific kind of sacrifice, as is the zeva. And of course, we see that Jethro didn't bring those two exclusively Hebrew sacrifices, each with their own special meaning, to any old god in general, which sacrifices, by the way, were only ordained in the law given at Mount Sinai. These sacrifices were, of course, just as it says in Hebrew, intended for the God named Jehovah. We're going to stop here and pick up the remainder of chapter 18 next time.